I never thought I'd be the kind of man who needed to second-guess his wife's laughter. But there I was, standing at the edge of our kitchen, staring at Mary as she giggled into her phone. Her eyes flickered to me briefly before she turned away, her voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't like her. Mary wasn't a whisperer. For 22 years, we'd been the kind of couple who finished each other's thoughts, said, "I love you," out loud in the middle of grocery stores, and shared everything, every little thing. But lately, there were moments where it felt like she was in another world, one I wasn't invited to. "Who's that?" I asked casually, leaning against the doorway. Her shoulders stiffened, just for a second, before she turned around with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, just Susan. She's planning a surprise for Tom's birthday. You know how she is, always making a big deal out of things." Susan was her best friend, but I didn't buy it. I'd known Mary long enough to spot when she was hiding something. I just didn't know what. Later that night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her phone buzz again. The soft glow of the screen lit up her face, and she bit her lip as she read whatever was there. She looked nervous, maybe even excited. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to roll over, close my eyes, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the thought nagged at me, like a stone in my shoe I couldn't shake loose. Something was wrong, and I couldn't let it go. The next morning, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I checked her phone while she was in the shower. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I wouldn't find anything. But I did. There was a thread of messages, dozens of them, with a name I didn't recognize, Jake. The texts weren't overtly romantic, but there was something about them. Too many smiley faces, too many inside jokes, that made my stomach twist. And then I saw the photos. Nothing explicit, just selfies. Mary smiling, her hair loose and windswept, the kind of smile she used to save for me. And then there was Jake. Young, maybe 18 or 19, with a cocky grin and eyes that sparkled with a kind of reckless confidence. He was one of our son's friends. I'd seen him a dozen times in our living room, sprawled out on the couch playing video games with Tyler. My chest tightened. I closed the phone quickly, my mind racing. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew the truth was something far worse than I wanted to admit. That evening, I tried to act normal. I sat across from Mary at the dinner table, watching as she chatted with Tyler about his upcoming graduation. She looked so normal, so familiar, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. But then Tyler mentioned Jake. "Jake wants to throw a party after graduation," Tyler said, grinning. "He said he'd invite you and Dad. You guys are practically his favorite people." I saw Mary's fork pause midair before she quickly recovered. "That's sweet of him," she said lightly, but her voice was just a touch too high, too strained. I couldn't eat after that. My appetite was gone, replaced by a sick feeling that settled deep in my gut. I excused myself early, claiming I had a headache, and went to our bedroom. Lying there in the dark, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I didn't know who Mary was anymore, or what she was capable of. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The days that followed felt like walking through quicksand. Every smile Mary gave me seemed forced. Every conversation felt rehearsed. I began to notice the little things I'd ignored before. How she always seemed to have an excuse to step out of the room when her phone rang. How she lingered a bit too long in the evenings, saying she was catching up on emails. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but I wasn't. One afternoon, Tyler had gone out with friends, and Mary was in the kitchen making tea. I stood in the doorway, watching her, trying to find the right words to confront her. But every time I opened my mouth, I saw her laughing with Jake on her phone, and the words froze in my throat. "Something on your mind?" she asked, her voice light, but there was a hint of tension in her tone. She didn't look at me as she poured the tea. I hesitated. "You've been distracted lately." That made her stop. She turned to me, her eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. "What do you mean?" "You've been different," I said carefully. "Quieter. I just feel like something's bothering you." Her laugh was brittle. "Oh, come on, Rob. You're overthinking. Work's just been stressful, that's all. Susan's been driving me crazy with her party planning too." There it was again, Susan. Always Susan. But this time, her tone was defensive, almost too eager to explain herself. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept her answer. But I didn't. That evening, after Mary had fallen asleep, I crept downstairs and grabbed her phone. I felt sick doing it, like I was violating some sacred trust. But then I remembered the texts and the photos, and any guilt I felt was drowned out by the ache in my chest. The messages were still there. But this time there was something new. A text from Jake sent earlier that day. "Can't stop thinking about you. Tomorrow. Usual place." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the casual way they talked. Like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together how my life had unraveled so quickly. I thought about Tyler, about how he idolized Jake. How could I tell him the truth? How could I destroy his friendship, his trust, his innocence? The next morning I decided I needed proof. Solid proof. Something undeniable. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but I couldn't stop myself. I followed Mary. She left the house around noon, saying she was meeting Susan for lunch. I waited until her car pulled out of the driveway before grabbing my keys and following at a safe distance. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I felt like a character in one of those crime dramas Mary loved so much. She didn't go to Susan's. Instead, she drove to a park on the other side of town. My stomach twisted when I saw Jake's car already parked there. Mary got out of her car, glancing around nervously before walking toward a secluded bench. Jake was waiting for her, his face lighting up as she approached. I parked a safe distance away, my hands shaking as I watched them. They talked for a few minutes, and then Jake leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from Mary's face. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled that smile and kissed him. Felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I wanted to storm over there, to yell, to demand answers. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in a moment that felt like it wasn't even mine. When they finally pulled apart, Mary looked around nervously, like she was afraid of being seen. Jake laughed, leaning back casually, like he didn't have a care in the world. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to shake Mary and ask her why. But instead, I just sat there, watching as the life I thought I knew crumbled before my eyes. That evening, Mary came home and kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice as cheerful as ever. I forced a smile. "Fine." But inside I was a storm. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. The following days were a haze of tension and barely controlled anger. Every time Mary smiled at me, every time she called me Han in that familiar, casual way, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The image of her with Jake haunted me, playing on a loop in my mind. I knew I couldn't keep it bottled up forever. Something had to give. One evening, Tyler came home later than usual. He was grinning from ear to ear, carrying a trophy he and his team had won at some video game tournament. He plopped down at the dinner table, showing it off, oblivious to the storm brewing between his parents. "Jake said I couldn't pull it off," he laughed. "But I totally crushed it." Mary's smile faltered, just for a second, before she forced it back into place. I noticed the way she stiffened at the mention of Jake's name, how she kept her eyes fixed on her plate. I couldn't take it anymore. "Jake seems to be around a lot lately," I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. Tyler shrugged. "Yeah, he's the best. He's like a big brother, you know? Always looking out for me." Mary's fork clattered against her plate. "He's a good kid," she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. "Is he?" I asked, my eyes boring into her. "You seem to think so." Her head snapped up, her cheeks flushed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tyler looked between us, confused. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Mary said quickly, forcing a smile. Your dad's just in one of his moods. But it wasn't nothing, and Tyler knew it. He excused himself awkwardly, leaving his trophy behind as he disappeared into his room. The moment his door closed, I turned to Mary. We need to talk. She crossed her arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. What's this about, Rob? You know what it's about, I said, my voice shaking. I know about Jake. Her eyes widened, but she recovered quickly, her face hardening. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I snapped. I saw you at the park. I know everything. Her lips parted as if to deny it, but then she froze. For the first time, I saw something crack in her. The bravado faded, replaced by guilt and fear. She slumped against the counter, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. How long? She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, her voice trembling. A few months. A few months, I repeated, incredulous. You've been sneaking around with an 18-year-old kid, our son's friend, for months? It's not like that, she said, her voice rising. It's not some stupid fling, Rob. He makes me feel. Don't you dare. I cut her off. Don't you dare try to justify this. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't want to hear it. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. I felt like a fool, like the past 22 years of my life had been a lie. I stormed out of the house, needing air, needing space. I ended up at the bar down the street, nursing a whiskey as I replayed the conversation in my head. Her words echoed like a broken record. He makes me feel what? Alive? Excited? I wasn't enough anymore? I stayed until closing time, the alcohol dulling the edges of my pain but doing little to quiet the storm inside me. When I got home, the house was dark. Mary had left a note on the counter. We need to talk. I'm sorry. I crumpled it in my fist and threw it away. The next morning, I confronted her again. I wanted answers. I needed to know how we'd gotten here, how the woman I'd loved for over 2 decades could do something so cruel, so reckless. Why Mary? I asked, my voice breaking. Why him? Why now? She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, she said. I don't know what's wrong with me, Rob. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said quietly. You didn't just hurt me. You betrayed Tyler too. Do you even realize what you've done to him? Her face crumpled, and she started sobbing. I never wanted this to happen. I was so lonely, Rob. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in work. I felt invisible. So this is my fault? I asked, anger flaring again. You're blaming me for this? I'm not blaming anyone, she said. I'm just trying to explain. But there was no explanation that could make this right. No excuse that could erase what she'd done. The house felt different after that conversation. Colder. Every interaction between Mary and me was brittle, held together by fraying threads of civility. Tyler, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath his feet, carried on as usual. Every time I looked at him, though, guilt stabbed at me. How could I shield him from the truth when it was clawing at my insides? Mary had taken to avoiding me whenever she could. She spent most of her time upstairs, claiming to clean or organize things that didn't need either. I wasn't sure if she was ashamed or just afraid of what else I might find out. I started digging, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because I needed clarity. I needed to know just how deep this betrayal ran. I began with Mary's phone, combing through her emails and texts. I'd already seen enough to confirm the affair, but the details told a story much worse than I had imagined. There were messages from Jake going back nearly 6 months. What started as casual banter escalated into something darker. Secret meetups, inside jokes that excluded everyone but them, and confessions of feelings that turned my stomach. I even found receipts for gifts Mary had bought him. A watch, concert tickets, even expensive sneakers. Gifts she never mentioned to me. But the most shocking discovery wasn't in Mary's phone. It was in Tyler's. Tyler had left his phone on the kitchen counter one evening while he was in the shower. I wasn't proud of myself for snooping, but I couldn't help it. I opened his group chat with his friends, including Jake, and scrolled through the messages. At first, it was harmless enough. Memes, jokes, plans to hang out. But then I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Jake, your mom's still hot for her age, man. You're lucky. Tyler, shut up, dude. That's weird. Jake, I'm just saying. If she wasn't married. My hands shook as I read the messages. Tyler didn't seem to realize the full extent of Jake's intent, brushing off the comments as tasteless jokes. But I knew better. I knew those weren't just words. That night, after Tyler went to bed, I confronted Mary again. I showed her the texts, my anger bubbling to the surface. Do you see this? I demanded, thrusting Tyler's phone toward her. He's been talking about you like this to our son. Do you even understand how disgusting this is? Mary's face turned pale as she read the messages. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear. I didn't know he'd say things like that to Tyler. That doesn't matter, I yelled. You let this happen. You let this kid into our home, into our lives, and now he's making a joke out of our family. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling. Terrible, awful mistake. But I never meant for any of this to happen. You have to believe me. I don't have to believe anything, I said coldly. You chose him over us, Mary. Over your son. Over me. In the days that followed, I started piecing together a plan. I wasn't going to let Jake or Mary destroy what was left of our family. But I couldn't rush into anything without thinking it through. Tyler deserved better than to have his world ripped apart without warning. I arranged to meet Jake. I told him it was about Tyler, that I wanted to talk about something important. He agreed easily, cocky as ever, like he had nothing to fear. We met at a diner across town, a place where no one would recognize us. When Jake walked in, he was all swagger, grinning like he owned the place. Mr. Harris, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. What's up? I stared at him, my jaw tight. I know what's been going on. His grin faltered. What do you mean? You and Mary, I said bluntly. I know everything. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He leaned back, his cocky demeanor slipping. Look, I didn't mean. I don't care what you meant, I interrupted. You crossed a line, Jake. A line you can't uncross. He swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. It wasn't. She came on to me. Okay? I didn't mean for it to happen. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to lose control. You think that makes it better? You think blaming her erases what you did? He didn't answer. He just sat there, looking like a scared kid caught in a lie. And maybe that's all he was. A stupid, reckless kid who didn't understand the damage he'd caused. But that didn't make it hurt any less. When I got home that night, I told Mary about the meeting. She broke down, crying harder than I'd ever seen her cry before. I'll fix this, she sobbed. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. But I didn't know if there was any fixing this. Some things, once broken, can never be put back together. The morning after my meeting with Jake, I felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a bottomless abyss. Tyler was blissfully unaware of the chaos beneath our roof, and Mary. She alternated between crying and walking on eggshells around me, as though afraid one wrong move would shatter what little remained of our marriage. But the truth? It was already shattered. I called Tyler into the living room that evening. My heart pounded as I tried to find the right words to explain the unexplainable. He plopped down on the couch, his trophy in hand, his carefree grin reminding me of how much I'd failed him. Tyler, we need to talk. I began, my voice tight. His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. What's up, Dad? You look serious. I need to tell you something about Jake, I said, each word feeling like it weighed a ton. He frowned, leaning forward. What about him? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. He's been seeing your mother, in a way that's completely inappropriate. More than that, he's been lying to you, lying to all of us. For a moment, Tyler just stared at me, his face blank as if he couldn't process what I just said. Then, Slowly, his expression shifted. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, a mix of anger and pain. "That's not funny, Dad," he said, his voice shaking. "Why would you say something like that?" "I wish it were a joke," I said quietly. "But it's not." I saw them, Tyler. I confronted him. "I'm sorry, son." He shot up from the couch, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. "No, no way. Jake wouldn't. Mom wouldn't." He stopped, his voice cracking. "How could she do this? To you? To us?" His words hung in the air, raw and heavy. I didn't have an answer, and even if I did, I wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. I watched helplessly as he grappled with the weight of betrayal from two people he trusted most. Later that night, Tyler confronted Mary. I stayed in the kitchen, listening as their voices rose and fell. "How could you, Mom?" Tyler shouted. "He's my friend. My friend. Do you even realize what you've done?" Mary's voice was barely audible, trembling with guilt. "I'm so sorry, Tyler. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," he yelled. "You hurt all of us. Was it worth it? Was he worth it?" There was a long silence, punctuated only by Mary's quiet sobs. I wanted to step in, to shield Tyler from the mess we'd created, but I knew he needed to let it out. This was his pain too. The days that followed were a blur of tension and anger. Tyler stopped speaking to Mary entirely, avoiding her at every turn. He spent most of his time out of the house, refusing to say where he was going. I couldn't blame him. I wanted to escape too. As for Mary, she tried everything to mend the pieces. She begged, pleaded, swore she'd never see Jake again, swore she'd do anything to fix what she'd broken. But her words felt hollow, like an apology for a wound too deep to heal. One evening, she came to me, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. "Rob," she said softly, "please, let's go to counseling. Let's try to work through this." I looked at her, at the woman I'd loved for over 2 decades, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no love. Just emptiness. "I don't think I can," I said quietly. "You didn't just break my heart, Mary. You broke our family. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her lip trembled, and she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever you need. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But I'll never stop trying to make this right." I didn't answer. Couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know what I needed. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, and I was left standing in the ruins trying to figure out how to move forward. That night, Tyler came to me. He sat down on the couch, his face etched with pain. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we'll get through this. Together." He nodded, and for the first time in days he looked at me, really looked at me. "I'm not ready to forgive her," he said. "And I don't think I ever will." "That's okay," I said. "Take your time. We'll figure it out." The weeks that followed were filled with difficult conversations, tense silences, and decisions I never thought I'd have to make. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Tyler moved through his days like a ghost, avoiding Mary at all costs. As for Mary, she tried to stay out of the way, retreating into herself, her attempts at reconciliation growing quieter with each passing day. One evening, as Tyler and I sat in the living room, he broke the silence. "Are you going to divorce her?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The question hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. I'd been avoiding it not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real. "I think I have to," I said finally. "What she did. It's not something I can come back from." Tyler nodded, his jaw tight. "Good. She doesn't deserve you, Dad." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I just felt tired. The next morning, I told Mary my decision. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together, as I explained that I couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. "I'm sorry," I said, "and I meant it. But this isn't something I can forgive. Not now." Maybe not ever. She didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. I understand, she whispered. I deserve this. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had hurt me, but as someone who was deeply broken in her own way. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me realize that this wasn't just my failure. It was hers too. Over the next few days, Mary began packing her things. She found an apartment across town and moved out quietly, leaving behind a house full of memories and a family she'd torn apart. Tyler didn't say goodbye. He stayed in his room, his door shut tight, as she loaded her car and drove away. That night, the house was eerily quiet. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where her favorite vase used to be, and felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I didn't miss her, not the person she'd become, but I missed the life we'd built together, the life I thought we had. In the weeks that followed, Tyler and I began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger bubbled up in both of us, directed at Mary, at Jake, at the unfairness of it all. But there were also moments of connection. Long conversations over dinner, shared laughs at old inside jokes, and a quiet understanding that we were in this together. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching the sunset, Tyler turned to me. You're a good dad, he said. Better than I deserve. I looked at him, startled. What are you talking about? You're a great kid, Ty. He shook his head, a sad smile on his face. I didn't see it, you know? I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. I trusted Jake. I thought he was my friend. That's not your fault, I said firmly. None of this is your fault. He nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. It would take time for him to believe that. It would take time for both of us to heal. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Mary reached out occasionally, asking about Tyler, apologizing again, but I kept my responses brief. I wasn't ready to let her back into our lives, even from a distance. As for Jake, he disappeared from Tyler's life entirely. Tyler didn't talk about him, and I didn't ask. Some things were better left buried. One day, Tyler came home from school with a smile on his face. Got an offer from State, he said, holding up an envelope. Full ride. That's amazing, I said, pulling him into a hug. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a spark of joy in his eyes, a glimpse of the young man he was becoming. As I watched him pack for college a few months later, I felt a sense of pride and hope I hadn't felt in a long time. We'd been through hell, but we'd come out the other side. Maybe not unscathed, but stronger in our own way. The night before he left, Tyler and I sat in the backyard again, just like we had so many times before. Thanks for everything, Dad, he said quietly, for not letting this destroy us. I nodded, my throat tight. We're Harris men, Ty. We don't give up. He smiled, and for the first time I believed it too. As he drove off the next morning, I stood in the driveway, watching until his car disappeared down the street. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life worth living. And that was enough.